Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I really want to thank Kat for setting up this wonderful weekend where we can have access to incredible information for free. I met Kat when she interviewed me last spring, and I'm so honored to be back to be part of her first wellness weekend. It really is such an inspiring initiative. I'm also really excited to be able to talk about something that's a huge passion of mine, which is helping people engage in spiritual practice. I really wanted to match Kat's initiative and give you as much value as I could in this talk, so I'm warning you, it is pretty dense. But I figured that if you're showing up to this, it's likely you're a thinking and intelligent person who's at least dabbled in this type of stuff before. So I really tried to strike a balance between simplifying this topic, but also giving you something to sink your teeth into. So in this talk, I'm going to speak about creating a spiritual practice and give you some steps for how to do that. I'm going to give you a little bit of history about myself and also about this broader cultural shift we're experiencing as we move from large-scale religion towards personal spiritual practice. I'm going to give you some skills for how to use rituals from other religions and create a spiritual practice that's right just for you. And I'm going to show you how to tap into your intuition, how to get creative, and how to have fun in designing your daily practice. I'm also going to tackle the huge issue of cultural appropriation and neo-spirituality, and hopefully give you some skills for how to know if your practices are damaging to others. I really want to try and demystify this a little bit so that we can integrate it into our practices. So, let's get to it. So in the last couple of years, the term spirituality has become really separate from the idea of religion. During most of history, having a spiritual practice was really synonymous with being religious. But we're suddenly at this weird tipping point where, with each generation, people are moving away from an organized religion. So according to a study by the Pew Research Center in 2012, 1/5 of the U.S. public and 1/3 of adults under the age of 30 are unaffiliated with any religion but identify with being spiritual in some way. What generation you're in drastically affects your opinion. For those who desire spiritual practice, those who are older prefer religion, while younger millennials drastically skew towards being unaffiliated. What's really interesting to me is that people aren't giving up on spirituality altogether. About 25 years ago, I remember watching a few key voices pushing for atheism, but I quickly watched this disillusionment of nihilism turn people towards finding a greater purpose. That same study states that even among the 4% of people who register as American atheists, 1/3 of them say that even though they don't believe in God, they do consider themselves spiritual and in some cases even religious. So why the shift? Well, it used to be that religion gave us guidelines for morality, gave us functional rules for living, as well as a sense of connection to something greater. Our religious inclination was passed to us by our parents and really solidified by the community we lived in for our entire lives. But suddenly, we have increased travel and access to information, and we're no longer surrounded by only one voice. If you're listening to this talk, then that means you have access to the internet, and that means you have all the written knowledge of the universe at your fingertips. On top of that, community is no longer linked to where we grew up. Most adults now have moved several times in our lives, and because of the internet, we can find a community that really aligns with our values. Also, because of broadened communities and new information, it's really difficult to pass over the problematic dogma that exists in most major religions. Many large religious spaces have issues with things like patriarchy, racism, and nationalism. Since we're living in a time where we can actually connect with and understand people who aren't exactly like us, people are starting to move away from ideas that are outdated and hurtful to others, which is awesome. So, if that's the case with religion, it's a huge problem. Why are people deciding to have any spiritual practice at all? Why not just move away from religion and be done with it? Well, science. Science tells us that people who are spiritual measurably have better lives. People who are spiritual are proven to be more optimistic, have a sense of purpose, have higher self-esteem, and more nourishing relationships. All of these aspects inherently make individuals more successful and have a higher quality of life. Because the fact is, Even with the gifts our era gives us, we live in a more emotionally challenging environment than our ancestors did. We all know this. Our ancestors' worlds used to be much smaller, which actually made stress much more manageable. When a problem occurred, it was generally in their physical space, which allowed them some capacity to try and solve it. That reduced their stress. But, as all of you know, that's no longer the case. We now live with constant information about all the terrible things that are happening globally, with little capacity to do something to help. We no longer get to leave our work at work because we're always reachable, and that makes us always available. Our multiple social media accounts leave us open to an exhaustive amount of human interaction, while making our relationships less meaningful and fulfilling. We are being failed by all of the things that are supposed to give us a sense of hope. We're being failed by religion, by our jobs, by our family structures. We have this near constant bombardment of problem solving and negotiations, which leads us to needing stimulants just to handle it. While at the same time, we have to numb out our stress with food and TV and intoxicants. Our spirits are begging for a break, for balance, and for rest. But one of the most amazing human qualities is that we evolve. We continue to let go of things that don't work for us and move towards things that do. And one of the things that's bringing back this sense of hope and purpose is this new era of spirituality. For the very first time, each person gets to make up a practice that's personal and truly fulfills our individual needs. In most cases, we're no longer ostracized for not practicing our local religion, but can find others of like mind to teach us and support us. Because of our vast access to information, we get to make something that's ours. And we're all finding massive hope in that. So before I get into some of these strategies about how to build your spiritual practice, I think it's probably important you know a little bit about me. I work as a professional artist, as you can probably see by my probably overkill surroundings, and I didn't always know that this new form of spirituality was my passion. In fact, most of my life, I've completely resisted it. I really floundered around trying to figure out what my purpose and message was. It's only in the last several years of my life that I realized that there was this solid silver string that tied everything I touched together. My upbringing, my education, and my art have all been focused on this one essential thing: trying to create a new way where I could feel connected to something greater than myself. When I look back at the history of my art practice, everything I ever made was putting forward a vision of this idealistic world that deeply connected through a sense of spirit. I resisted the truth of my purpose for so long because I aligned spirit with a place of pain and disconnection. I needed a huge amount of healing to get where I am today. And now I realize that all of that experience was grooming me to support others on their own journey to their own spirituality. So my story is that I grew up as part of an abusive and fundamental religious culture. My father was a Baptist pastor, so my upbringing was extremely focused on the challenging way that my biological family practiced their doctrine. To say that my particular Christian upbringing was unhealthy would be putting it mildly. When I was growing up, the roles that I was allowed to have in life were extremely narrow, especially in regards to my gender as a woman. I had a set way that I was supposed to live, and any deviation from that caused serious and violent repercussions. I grew up believing in a spiteful and vengeful God, this male deity who punished more than he loved and judged more than he cared for. So before I go further in this story, I really do want to note that I am a huge advocate for religious freedom. I feel that religious spaces, even fundamental ones, are important in making up our wonderful and diverse world. And I do really believe that for some people, being part of an organized religion is healing and supportive. And I think that anyone who chooses religious beliefs should be allowed to do so and practice however they need, as long as it doesn't elicit violence on others. And I want to be clear that the type of skills I'm speaking about today do not exclude those who are religious. But what I do want to convey to you is that my experience with the space I grew up in was incredibly non-inclusive and damaging. It not only focused on personal disempowerment, but it took extreme issue with the treatment of women, the environment, as well as it had nationalistic and racist tendencies. So it really wasn't a space that cared for or held space for others. But in dichotomy to this spiritually narrow upbringing, I had this culturally vast childhood. My father was what they call an intern pastor, which meant that we were shuffled from place to place every few months. Currently, I reside in Montreal, Canada, which is the 57th city that I have lived in, with places that have spanned North, Central America, Europe, and Asia. So something that type of lifestyle gave me was a lack of attachment to particular cultural space. Each new place gave me some new piece of identity that didn't always link to what I had known before. The societal rituals and cultural norms changed from place to place, and so I became a bit of this hodgepodge person with a made-up idea of what normal was supposed to look like. When I left home at 16, my transient lifestyle continued and completely affected the idea of what community means to me. Because my location was continually changing, I never had a community around me that anchored my identity. This allowed me a type of freedom of choice around the type of people that I was in touch with. So rather than having to make friends with whoever was in my vicinity, I was exposed to a large number of people who I could then choose to stay in touch with. The idea of traveling or moving to engage with the humans I chose as my community became a logical part of my life. So this connected me to a community of people that I have based a large part of my art practice around, the space of transformational festivals. Some of you may be familiar with this space. So these spaces are full of other individuals who also lead a mobile existence and are willing to travel to find other like-minded people to connect with. So a transformational festival is a co-created temporary space that focuses on a community building ethic and a value system that celebrates personal growth, social responsibility, creative expression, and spirituality. Although many of these spaces may look similar to things like music festivals, they're really distinguished by such features as seminars, classes, ceremonies, installation art or other visual art, the availability of whole food and body work, and a sustainable environmental policy. So this was the community that by my teens I'd sought out and then really came of age in. Rather than growing up in a traditional community located in my vicinity, my peers and influences were others who were focused on the creation of a new type of cultural space. Between this community interaction and my lack of attachment to culture or physical place, the world around me became one that I had the capacity to design and create from scratch. Because of all of these spaces I had an experience in, there is now a fluidity to my beliefs and life practices. While the dogma of religion never sat well with me, it did give me a sense of connection to spirit and the great mysteries of our world. I see ritual and religion as valuable in allowing humans to connect to each other and the world around them. But I didn't want to stop at that dogma. So now I feel this allowance to cherry pick different types of symbology or cultural practices and make them into something that feels personal and unique. My lack of attachment to culture or place has created a practice where I feel like I can choose which rituals and symbols hold universal truth for me, while discarding religious practices that I really don't feel resonate anymore. The themes in my personal art practice now focus almost entirely on the creation of new types of religious spaces and objects. I see this massive evolution of people who desire to explore the universal truths of spirituality rather than established religion. In my art, I experiment with taking established ritual and religion and creating something new. Practicing as somewhat of a religious poacher, I take ideas and concepts from various worldwide religious spaces and make something that serves a new generation. So this is the skill set I really want to convey to you, hopefully to help you feel more freedom around creating your own spiritual practice. Even if you are committed to a specific religion or practice already, I really think these skills are important for you too. Everyone is different, and it's essential to create a life that resonates with you rather than following a cookie cutter that doesn't quite fit. This is how we live our fullest lives. So, enough about me. Let's get to it. What is spirituality really? So, spirituality is the quality of being concerned with the human spirit, as opposed to material or physical things. It gives you a feeling that there's something greater than yourself, and that there's more to being human than our sensory experience. So it's pretty open, right? That means that it can incorporate a vast number of beliefs and practices. You can believe in an all-knowing deity, you can believe that aliens birthed us here, you can believe that electromagnetic force connects us all, you can have no idea what our origin story is, but believe we're all interconnected in some unknowable way. Science shows us that it does not matter what you believe. The benefits come from how you practice that belief. So there are 3 keys that give us the benefits we're looking for. Number 1, it gives you a sense of being supported by something greater than yourself. Number 2, it gives you a sense of purpose. And number 3, it decreases your stress and makes you feel more joyful and hopeful. So if you look at these factors, it really means that your spiritual practice can look like almost anything and will get the benefits we're looking for. And I'll reiterate the benefits that science says we get. We get a greater sense of purpose, fulfillment, connection, better relationships, better health, more success and vitality. Just as a whole, we get a better quality of life. So no matter what you choose to incorporate in your life, the point is that it's meaningful to you. My deepest desire is that you walk away from this talk with the belief that you can design whatever practice works for you and stop listening to all those things that you've been told will make us happy. So, if we need to design anything we want, where do we start? Well, step number 1. Step 1 in designing your spiritual practice is to look at the universal truths in religion. That's right, I'm going to bring us back to religion. Because although I've been talking about all the reasons humanity is moving away from organized religion, I want to encourage you not to discount it completely. The thing is that religions were made from thousands and thousands of years of our ancestors testing what worked for them. Not only is this ancestral experimentation extremely valuable, but we've also been genetically encoded with things that feel good, safe, and comfortable for us. If we ignore these lessons from religion as a whole, it's easy to get either completely overwhelmed with the vastness of possibility or just stuck in the idea that we have to be completely unique, and both ideas can push us towards nihilism and despair. So let's use what we've been given as a jumping off point. One of the best things I can suggest is to start to look for some of the universal truths between religions. If you look at the core practices of any religion, they all have different ways of expressing the exact same thing. All practices have practices of contemplation, community, prayer, self-expression, clearing bad energy, grounding, mindfulness, and acts of service. So, when you're looking to add a practice into your life, you can start with a broad idea of what you want more of in your day. So I'll list those things again for you so you can think about it or write it down. Contemplation, community, prayer, self-expression, clearing bad energy, grounding, mindfulness, and acts of service. So, for example, let's say that you want more time for rest and contemplation in your life. Start to do a little research on how different religions practice that. There's Shabbat, or the Day of Rest in Judaism, Anusati meditation in Buddhism, Dhyana meditation in Hinduism, contemplative prayer in Christianity, the tree of contemplative practices in Islam, etc., etc., etc. You can literally pick any religion and Google that religion plus contemplative practice, and you will come up with dozens of examples. So read through whatever rituals call to you, and I'll talk about how to use your intuition to do that in a minute, and pick a couple that you feel called to try. You're really going to use intuition or gut feelings to pick the ones you're interested in. It's valuable to take whatever ritual you choose exactly as it has been given and get good at it before you make any changes. I used to have this art teacher that said Picasso could paint a perfect apple before he invented Cubism. The point being that we tend to need to fully understand something before we change it into something more suited to us. So, set aside time to experiment with whatever you want to try and really give it your full effort. Don't just do it once. Everything feels weird the first time we try it. If you're trying to create a daily practice, then do it every day. Unless, of course, there's a specified time frame for it in the original ritual, like having a day of rest once a week. The point is to be really present with your experience of this ritual. If you can practice with people from that tradition who are willing to teach you, even better. Give each thing you experiment with your full and fair attention. After each practice, write down what that ritual made you feel. Suss out the things that felt really good and the things that didn't feel quite right. Use your intuition to help you figure out what parts you want to keep and what parts you want to let go or change. Which brings me to step number 2, using your intuition. So, here's a little story about intuition that just happened this week. I was supposed to be giving this talk live on Zoom today. I'd been prepping this for weeks and I was completely prepared for this live talk. But I'm in the middle of travel right now and we've been in this new cabin this week. So by all appearances, the internet connection I have here is stable. We've been streaming movies and doing things on the internet with no problems. My logical brain told me that I would have absolutely no problems being able to give this talk. But on Thursday, I had this nagging little voice inside me that told me I might not be able to do a live Zoom call. So, just to be careful, I decided to set up a test call with Kat, and wouldn't you know it, for the life of us, we could not get a call to work. So because I listened to my intuition, I was able to record something in advance so that I could be with you here today. If I hadn't, my talk would have been one terrible hour of technical difficulties and the inability to share my message with you. That is what listening to your intuition is for. However, intuition is one of the things that tends to be beat out of us at a young age. Personally, I was a really sensitive child. I saw and felt things that couldn't be explained with logic. When I told my parents about these things I experienced, I received extreme repercussions for believing in things that weren't real. I was punished for having an overactive imagination or for making things up. Because of that, I shut down that still, small voice. I grew up hardened with the belief that feelings were bad and I couldn't trust my gut. I was lucky that I encountered people in intentional communities who taught me that my intuition was a valuable asset. They helped me see that anyone can wake up their intuition, even if they've numbed it out for a long time. So we all have different natural inclinations, but all of us have the capacity to feel our intuition. It is that still, small voice that tells us something that either adds to or contradicts our logical brain. Because our brain has 2 systems in place. The first one is effortless and quick. It's the thing that helps us react quickly and decide what feels right or wrong for us. The second system is more deliberate and analytical. And both systems are essential in helping us live our fulfilled lives. So there was this recent study published in the journal Science by Dr. Antonio Damasio, which showed that specific brain regions are able to anticipate reward and punishment. I won't get into great detail about the experiment, but the gist of it was that the subjects had different card decks that gave them either monetary rewards or punishment. So there were regular subjects and subjects with brain damage to the area where decisions are made. All of their palms were wired with this machine that detected changes in the electrical conductance of skin, which is thought to reflect types of emotion that doesn't actually reach conscious awareness. So the subjects had to pull cards randomly and blindly from the decks, but unbeknown to them, the scientists had set it up so there were good decks and there were bad decks, which either rewarded you more or punished you more. After a while, the subjects without brain damage started showing anticipatory reactions to having to choose the bad decks. Their palms began to sweat when they reached for the undesired cards, and they began playing advantageously before they even knew what was happening. Their hunches were able to be scientifically measured as helping them. One of the researchers, Dr. Koslin, stated that emotion apparently is not something that necessarily clouds reasoning, but rather seems to provide an essential foundation for different kinds of reasoning. So how do we tap into this type of emotion and use it in deciding what's right for our spiritual practice? Well, the first thing is to be quiet. We cannot hear something when we're not listening. Get still and try to feel what's going on in your body. One of my favorite ways to practice listening to it is to give myself two options. I sit really still and I focus on one option. I try to be really present with my environment, giving my intuition all the information it needs to inform my decision. I see what comes up for me. If the option I'm focused on is wrong for me, I'll often feel a little cold. I'll have a feeling of resistance in my body, slight feelings of nausea. In general, the feelings will be uncomfortable. If the option is right for me, I'll generally feel a little bit of space and openness in my chest. It will feel exciting and nourishing. If you're not used to feeling your intuition, I encourage you to start with choices between things that are very simple. If you start with giant decisions, your logical brain and stress will take over very quickly. When I first started learning, I used 2 different crystals, deciding which one I wanted to carry with me that day. I'd hold one in my hand and I'd see the sensations it would give me, and then hold the other and see if it felt differently. When you're deciding on things that are right for your spiritual practice, learn what you can about the practice. After you have all the information, quiet your mind and see what bodily sensations come up for you. If something feels right for you, you should feel a feeling of space. If something is wrong, it's going to feel uncomfortable. If something isn't right for you, try not to judge that intuition. Just let it go and move on to something else until you find a practice that feels truly joyful. I really want you to focus on that feeling of joy. Not everything needs to feel easy or simple, but anything you do daily should be making you feel holistically better, not worse. If you feel depleted after your practice, instead of grounded and open and a sense of openness, then that practice is probably not right for you. So step number 3 is to get creative with it. So once you found something that's in alignment with your intuition, go a little bit deeper. The whole point of making your own spiritual practice is that it's yours. So it's time to get creative and play with it. Again, this is after you've given it the time and attention of practicing the initial ritual as it was taught to you. Once you feel like you've got the hang of it, play with it. When I first discovered meditation, I only knew what I saw around me. People who meditate are supposed to sit still on a cushion in absolute silence. They're supposed to look peaceful and not move a muscle for as many hours as you can stand it. I mean, don't get me wrong. Sometimes I do practice that type of meditation and I get something out of it. I really do. But what actually works so much better for me is to move. The first time I discovered this, I was sitting on my meditation cushion in the middle of the living room. I was really in the present moment, and I started following what my intuition was pulling me towards. Within minutes, I was up on my feet, and I was waving my arms all around and making my body all squiggly. I was humming and wiggling around, and I probably looked ridiculous. The thing was that I was more in the present moment than I had ever been before. It was so fulfilling, and I ended up doing it for almost an hour without even noticing the time. By the end, I was laughing out loud and completely full of joy. I still regularly do this wiggle meditation. It really does help me get grounded in the present and in my body. But I probably never would have found something that works for me if I'd gotten stuck in the idea of how meditation is supposed to be practiced. In my books, supposed to is a dirty word. What I care about is really what works. I also find the practice of journaling my experience really helpful. When I'm experimenting with something new, I like to write down how I'm feeling after I've done something. It not only makes me have to verbalize my experience, but that way I can go back and look at whether something was successful or not. But at the end of the day, the only rule of mine is to follow my bliss. If something feels aligned, I'll keep doing it. If I feel like it's not serving me, I will release it with love. So after these first steps, the next one is to do something daily. So once you've found spiritual things that you want to integrate in your life, commitment is key. They call it a practice because you're not going to get the maximum benefit the first time you do it. Think of it as exercise. You don't get abs the first time you do sit-ups. And let me remind you, the benefits are that we have a higher quality of life, greater sense of purpose, better relationships, more success, more vitality. And the stronger you make these spiritual muscles and the more consistent you are, the more benefits that you will get. If you're just starting out, I encourage you to make an upfront agreement with yourself and write out your intention. We can't achieve our goals unless we know the steps to our outcome. Decide for yourself how often and for how long you need to do something to get the benefits from it. Write down when, where, and for how long you're going to do something, and then stick that thing you wrote somewhere that you'll see it. Writing it down really ensures that we can't lie to ourselves about our commitment. Once you get into the habit, you don't have to do this step, but if you don't have a stable practice yet, having that visual reminder will help. I like to do my spiritual practice in the mornings. I find that mornings are when I'm the softest and I'm the most open to my intuition. But even though I work for myself, it's often really hard to block out that time. We live in a culture that starts at 7 a.m. and hits the ground running, and I honestly have to turn down some clients and jobs that want me on that timeline. It's not always easy to make that choice. But what makes it easy is when I see the results from my consistent practice. When I take the time, it sets the tone for the rest of my day. I'm more focused, I'm kinder, I'm more relaxed. It also gives me the added benefit of not having to struggle to fit it in as my day gets busy. So while morning practice may not be for you, I do encourage you to pick a time frame and stick with it. When we say, I will get to it later, you know this, we rarely do. Also, be kind to yourself. You probably won't be consistent right away. It takes time to build a habit. If you miss a day or two, forgive yourself, let it go graciously, and move on. The same as if you try to integrate something that doesn't really work. The goal is to be fluid and make something that really fits into your life. If something isn't working for you, send it off with light and love and try something else. Where focus goes, energy flows, and the more you show up with intention, the more it will show up for you. I remember when I first started pulling oracle cards, I approached them with this feeling like it really wouldn't work. I didn't give it very much attention or weight, and because of that, my practice was flaky at best. Instead of approaching it with what I could learn, I kept trying to prove to myself that it wasn't going to work. The shift really happened when I decided to be open and do it every single day, no matter what. I really sat with what the cards were saying. I looked back at what had been told from days before. The consistency and the trust was when the miracles really started to happen for me. The synchronicities and patterns began to emerge because my practice and learnings became linked into this bigger picture every single day that I did it. Now, pulling cards is one of the cores of my practice. The fulfillment and support I get from that practice is consistent. I feel a deeper trust in a benevolent universe because I see the web that the cards paint for me. Every day I get blown away, laugh, or learn something new about myself because I'm giving that practice consistent attention. Okay, so we have our first 4 steps. Number 1, look at the universal truths and learn what rituals have already been given to us. Number 2, tap into our intuition and see what feels right for us. Number 3, get creative with it, make it our own. And number 4 is to do something daily. Well, all of these things will take your attention and time. They really should be easy and fun. If you start to feel a tightness or an expectation around any of these steps, it means that you're starting to focus on ego instead of spirit. Reframe to make sure that at the end goal of this practice is joy and a better quality of life. All of this should be reducing your stress, not adding to it. Okay, y'all still with me? Because now it's time to move on to a topic that's not quite so joyful or fun. and that is the important discussion of cultural appropriation. I encourage you not to check out of this part of the talk because, well, this conversation is uncomfortable for a lot of us. If you're able to wrap your mind around it, then it's going to decrease your stress overall. I really should have titled this talk 4 Easy Steps and 1 Not So Easy Step, because although creating a personal spiritual practice for yourself is super easy, the political and social climate that we're in right now makes one part of this equation very challenging. The fact is that when we start to talk about cherry picking from cultural and religious space, we need to talk about the ginormous issue of cultural appropriation. If we're engaging in spirituality to live better lives and be better people, then one of our biggest points of focus should be how to care for others. With our increased availability of information, we're really unable to escape just how badly colonialism has ravaged our world, and we need to make sure that we're not still on that path. So I want to try and break it down for you, so hopefully we can make some emotional space around it and we can feel a little bit more free exploring some of the fun stuff. So most of you, if you're in this talk, will probably be familiar with the conversation around cultural appropriation. And if you're familiar, I'm sure you already know that this issue is extremely complex and really exhausting to think about. But it's also extremely important that we normalize these discussions and try to tackle these issues, because this has to do with why we're engaging with spirituality in the first place, which is to be better individuals. And we can't be better if we're content with harming those around us. Avoiding this conversation is also something I see being detrimental to people creating a deep spiritual life. When I see people get confronted with this, I often watch them shut down exploration altogether and miss out on the teachings that are available to them. It may not be comfortable, but incorporating cultural appropriation conversations is essential in creating a rich spiritual life. So what is cultural appropriation exactly? This is one of my main areas of research because I make art that uses many cultural symbols, and I want to make sure that I'm using them in a way that's helpful and not harmful. So, cultural appropriation occurs when people outside of a specific cultural space can make money or gain social capital from artifacts or cultural ideas when people who are in that community cannot. This is a complex idea, but the basis of it comes down to a power dynamic. So a good anecdote to describe this is the New Age movement in the 80s, where Native American spirituality was suddenly seen by the white population as something to be desired. There was this huge disconnect between the perceived Native American spirituality and what was actually happening in the lives of people in that cultural group. It perpetuated the stereotype of the noble native sharing spiritual wisdom with the white man. All the while, these New Agers had no real understanding of Native people and no touchstone with their actual struggle for survival. What occurred was this huge movement of people and companies selling and profiting off of distorted Native American spiritual artifacts. And at the same time that Westerners were profiting off these objects, there were still laws all across North America that banned Native Americans from even owning their own artifacts, let alone selling them. While natives could get punished for having a spiritual item in their home, Caucasians could happily buy and sell these objects with no repercussions. The time we were deep in this governmental process of trying to forcefully assimilate indigenous people to a Western way of life. We denied them any right to language, land, communities, and spiritual artifacts, and it was part of this horrific process. This still transcends to today, when the largest producer of Aboriginal artifacts is China, while a large number of Native populations are still impoverished and can't make money off of their art or artifacts. This is what super messed up, harmful appropriation looks like. It is not okay. And this is only one example from many, many harmed cultures. And while we may not be personally responsible for the atrocities that led to the world's current racial climate, those who are white are still benefiting from this history. And while I did not commit the crimes of my Caucasian ancestors, I am responsible to help clean up the mess. Any privileged person or thinking, caring citizen needs to rise up to meet this issue with a desire to heal it and not continue hurting others. So the problem is that we're right in the middle of this cultural shift. We're trying not to continue harming persecuted cultural groups, but at the same time, we're entering a revolution where, for the first time, almost all global knowledge is available to us. And we desire to use that cultural knowledge to help us evolve as a species. The way forward through this appropriation minefield is on a spectrum of opinion, which of course leads to a huge amount of disagreement. This problem is so vast and complex, so it's really hard to know how to approach it in a solution-focused way and not just get bogged down with problems and guilt. I personally know that I have to continually grow my own understanding around this as the conversation evolves, and that I'm never going to be successful in understanding every single person's experience or viewpoint, but all I can do is humbly try. So here's why it's important for us to address on our spiritual path. We all want to view ourselves as good people, as the hero of our own story. And learning that we're hurting others, even if it's unintentionally, brings up a lot of shame. And what happens when we feel shame? We generally have one of two responses. We either ignore the fact that the behavior we're doing is hurtful, and we continue doing it, or we shut down completely and we never want to do or think about what we've done wrong again. So the most common response I see when I watch others get informed about cultural appropriation in their spiritual practice is that they shut down. They never want to touch that bad behavior ever again. A great example for this is the practice of smudging. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, smudging is a spiritual practice from particular native populations where a sacred dried plant is burned and the smoke is used to cleanse something. Many of you probably have seen this personally, or even personally done this practice with sage or Palo Santo. So this is one of the things that has come into conflict in the last couple of years as a point of harmful appropriation. But it's a really convoluted dialogue, even among Native Americans, as to whether it's okay or not. And when there's confusion, there's no clear answer, and so people feel this sense of shame, they shut down and they never touch it or any other behavior like it again. Any behavior like it again. This shame precludes us from using a tool that could be really beneficial. And this is why it becomes a problem, because history tells us that using air or smoke or fanning to clear energy has been around many historical cultures. And that means that it's a really powerful ritual that still carries energy and has a potential to be an effective spiritual practice for a lot of us. So when we shut down and we don't explore powerful teachings from our ancestors because we're feeling a sense of shame, then we're losing out on a practice that could be really healing for us. So the goal is, instead of shutting down when we're faced with these conversations about cultural appropriation, to meet it with presence and humility, to do our best to hear and care for people who are suffering without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm going to try and simplify it for you a little bit and hopefully give you some tools for how to deal with it. Cultural appropriation is taking from a culture that's not our own. This can include ways of knowledge, intellectual property, cultural expressions and artifacts. But the problem with this definition is that the terms culture and taking are intangible ideas at best. So this definition can't really define the boundaries of where cultural appropriation begins and ends. Because if we're taking from a culture that's not our own, that means that the lines of culture need to be really well defined. But we all know that the lines of culture are extremely fluid because individuals are fluid. Add to that the fact that cultural practices are formed from various influences from other cultures and change over time. And then add to that the phenomena of multiple discovery, where cultures and individuals from around the globe who have no interaction come up with the same ideas at the same time. This means that the lines of where culture begin and end are complicated at best. So, since we can't rigidly define culture, let's try and make it personal. Let's say that each human being can roughly define the type of ideas and practices you grew up with and were taught, and that everything outside of that is another cultural space. So if you didn't grow up with it, it's not yours. But then we progress. As an adult in this internet era, we're going to engage with millions of ideas that we didn't grow up with. And those ideas are going to expand our horizons and help us evolve. So by all definition, most ideas we encounter will come from someone else's cultural space. This is why the issue of cultural appropriation is so exhausting to think about. How do we engage with those spaces in a healthy way that's not damaging so that we can grow and expand our ideas of the world? So there's a cultural theorist who seems to have an answer for us. His name is Richard A. Rogers, and he places appropriation into 4 categories for us: dominance, exploitation, exchange, and transculturation. 2 of these practices are damaging, and 2 of these practices are healthy. So, first off, we need to move away from the idea that all cultural interaction is damaging and define which is which. So, dominance is the practice of desiring power over another. Exploitation is treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work. And both of these actions can be seen in the example of Native American spirituality being commodified. People desired to subjugate natives, while at the same time they desired to profit from their spirituality. So on the flip side, exchange is the act of giving and receiving where both parties benefit equally. Transculturation is defined as seeing oneself in the other. It doesn't mean acquiring another culture, which is acculturation, or losing or uprooting a previous culture, deculturation. Instead, it takes multiple spaces of cultural phenomena and merges them into something new that benefits both cultural spaces. So I'm going to try and simplify that further. Let's pretend that someone who is physically smaller and weaker than you has something you want. You have 4 options. 1, you could physically make that person afraid of you and force them to give you that object. 2, you could steal or mimic that object and sell it for profit. 3, you could trade them for that object with something of equal value. Or 4, you could connect with that person, start a relationship where you benefit their lives and they benefit yours, and in that process, the object naturally becomes shared property because it benefits everyone. So, if we take Rogers' theory and we apply it to our lives, cultural appropriation really comes down to the intention that leads to action. And this makes it a lot simpler because you can sit with yourself and you can ask sincere questions about how you are engaging with ideas. The first question: does using this idea or object give me a sense of power over another individual? Or am I trying to make someone else feel small? In the case of most of you listening to this talk, most of us will probably answer no to this question, because if we're seeking a spiritual path, the feeling of power over another will likely feel really icky and unappealing. So the second question: am I monetizing or gaining social capital from this idea or object when someone from the culture it came from cannot? This one actually may apply to many of us in the spiritual arena. When we go back to the area of North American Native spirituality, there are many people who did not grow up in that tradition who are currently making money off of traditional Native practices or objects. And remember, this applies to social capital too. For example, if you're posting something on your Facebook or Instagram and it's gaining you followers, you are gaining social capital from it. If we simplify this, it means that if we're using a practice in our private space and we're not making money or gaining social capital off of it, then it's not exploitation. But as soon as you try to turn that into a job or sell those items, you need to become a lot more aware of exploitation issues And you should start doing some research around how to do that in a respectful way that's aligned with the tradition and supports that community. So, 2 questions. Is this giving me a sense of power over someone? And am I gaining social capital from it? If the answer is no to both these questions, then Rogers would say that it is not unhealthy appropriation. So, on the flip side, when you engage with these ideas, is there an equal exchange between you and someone else? Do both sides benefit when you share ideas? If you feel this sense of equal exchange, then give yourself some space to relax and enjoy the shared knowledge. To take that even further, the option of transculturation feels far and away the best, and that's because it's focused on the relationship. When we stop trying to consume the world around us for what we can get from it, and instead we desire to make real connections and contribute, the conversation around cultural appropriation becomes so much simpler. So let's bring this back to the conversation about creating a personal spiritual practice and focus your exploration towards connection. When you're exploring a new spiritual idea, there will likely be something from a space that you didn't grow up with that you might like to have as a part of your practice. So instead of just ignoring it, or feeling ashamed that you want to engage with it in the first place, or just taking it and using it however you want, why not find other humans who did grow up with it and get them to teach you about it? See what you can give them back that actually benefits them, whether it's something from your life experience, another object, money, time, friendship. Be humble and be willing to learn. Let your focus be on the contribution and not the consumption. When we do this, we actually begin to expand the understanding and skill set available to us as humans. We also get to learn new skills and practices that start to benefit everyone and help heal the world around us. The more respectfully we share ideas with humility and a desire to make the world a better place, the better everything becomes. Okay, so there it is, our 5 steps to a personal spiritual practice. 1. Learn from rituals that have already been given to us. 2. Tap into your intuition and see what feels right for you. 3, to get creative with it and make it your own. 4 is to do something daily. And the whopping 5, how to do it all without hurting others. Thank you all for sticking with me through all of that. I was fully expecting to be able to have a question and answer period in my talk, but I did end up needing to pre-record this. But I really would love if any of you want to reach out and keep this conversation going with me. The best places to find me are either on my website at jodisharp.ca, that's JODISHARP.ca, or Instagram at Jodi Sharp Art. I love talking about this. It's really a passion of mine, and I love connecting with new people. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear your questions and comments. Thank you again so much to Kat for creating this incredible experience. It really has been such a wonderful weekend. I hope you all enjoy the speakers coming up, and I do hope to hear from some of you soon. Thank you.